The Brach's Pick-A-Mix bin stood at the end of aisle 7 in every grocery store in America, and you could smell it before you saw it. Butterscotch and peppermint and something warm and sugary that had no name, but every child who ever walked past it knew exactly what it was. You were 5 years old, holding your mother's hand, and the moment you turned that corner, your feet stopped moving because the most beautiful thing you had ever seen was waiting for you behind a low glass wall. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. 40 open bins in a single wooden display, each one filled to the brim with a different candy, each one a different color, each one with a small metal scoop resting on top like an invitation that did not need words. Butterscotch discs the color of November sunlight, cinnamon imperials as red as a fire truck, milk-made caramels wrapped in that tight wax paper you had to twist off with your teeth, star-bright peppermints in cellophane that crinkled when you picked them up, jelly nougats in pink and white and brown that were softer than anything else in the store, Neapolitan coconuts striped in chocolate and pink and white that tasted like a vacation to a place you had never been, royals in dark chocolate with cream centers that felt expensive even when they cost 3 cents, and candy corn, mountains of candy corn that appeared every October and vanished by November and came back every single year of your life until one year it did not. You did not just look at those bins. You studied them. You stood on your toes and leaned over the edge and calculated how many butterscotch discs you could fit into one paper bag without your mother noticing that you had gone over budget. The metal scoop was heavy in your hand, heavier than a toy, lighter than a tool, and the sound it made scraping through a bin of hard candy was a sound that exists nowhere else in the modern world. You held the paper bag open with one hand and tilted the scoop with the other, and the candies tumbled in with a rattling rush that made your heart beat faster because every piece that landed in that bag was yours. You chose it, you scooped it, you earned it by behaving yourself for the last 45 minutes while your mother compared prices on canned tomatoes and read the back of a cereal box. That was the deal. And every child in America understood it without being told. You could pick from the Brach's bin if you were good in the store. One bag, one trip down the candy aisle, one chance to build the perfect combination of sweet and sour and chocolate and mint and butterscotch, weighted by the pound and paid for at the register like everything else in the cart. Your mother handed the bag to the cashier and the cashier set it on the scale, and your mother glanced at the price and then glanced at you, and you knew from the look on her face whether you had gotten away with something or gone too far. That look, half amusement, half resignation, was part of the experience. So was the ride home, sitting in the back seat with the paper bag between your knees, eating one butterscotch disc while it was still warm from your hand. In October, the bins changed. The butterscotch and peppermint made room for candy corn and mellow cream pumpkins and harvest mix in orange and brown and yellow, and the whole display turned into autumn overnight. You could smell Halloween coming from 10 feet away. Your mother bought a bag of candy corn for the trick-or-treaters and a separate bag for the family, and by October 15th, the family bag was gone and she was quietly dipping into the trick-or-treat supply. At Christmas, the bins filled with ribbon candy and candy canes and those small foil-wrapped chocolate bells that looked like ornaments and tasted like the season itself. The Brach's display was not just a candy rack, it was a calendar. It told you what time of year it was by what was in the bins, and every holiday in your childhood had a flavor that came from that display and no other place. Your grandmother had a crystal bowl on her coffee table that was never empty. She filled it from the same bins, at the same store, and carried it home in the same paper bags. But at grandmother's house, the candy was not a reward for good behavior. It was simply there, waiting. Butterscotch discs and caramels and peppermint drops and those small chocolate creams with the soft centers that tasted like nothing you could buy anywhere else. You walked through her front door and the bowl was on the table and you did not ask permission because you did not need to. She watched you reach into it from across the room and she smiled because feeding you was the only language she had left that still worked every time. Summer vacations and Christmas mornings at her house always started the same way. The candy was out before you arrived. Jelly, nougats, Neapolitan coconuts, royals, caramels, and hard candies arranged in the bowl like a small edible garden. By the end of the week, every wrapper was gone. Every last piece consumed by children who would not understand for another 40 years what it meant that a woman who survived the Depression and 2 wars spent her money on candy she would never eat herself, just so the grandchildren would always have a reason to walk through her door. The bowl is still in a cabinet somewhere. The candy is not. She is not. And the fact that those 2 absences feel equally permanent is something you are only now old enough to understand. Nobody ever paid full price for the Pick-a-Mix candy. That is a truth every American over the age of 40 will confirm if you ask them quietly enough. Children reached into the bins with bare hands. Teenagers palmed a caramel while pretending to examine the jelly beans. Grown men dropped a butterscotch into their coat pocket while their wives were in the dairy aisle. There was a small cardboard box on the display that said, "Samples, 10 cents each, or 3 for a quarter." And the honor system lasted about 6 minutes before the first person decided that tasting was free. The bins had no lids, the scoops had no locks, the candy sat in the open air of a public supermarket, touched by every hand that passed, and nobody cared because it was the 1970s and the world had not yet decided that everything edible needed to be wrapped in plastic and sealed with a tamper-proof strip. The hygiene was appalling, the joy was immeasurable, and every single person reading this right now just smiled because you did it too. The man who started it all arrived in Chicago from Germany in 1881 with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a knowledge of candy that he had learned from other men who had learned it from other men before them. Emil J. Brach saved $1,000 every cent he had, and in 1904 he opened a storefront on the corner of North Avenue and Town Street and called it Brach's Palace of Sweets. The store was 18 feet wide. Behind the counter was a candy case and an ice cream parlor. Behind the partition was the kitchen where he made the candy himself in a single kettle. His 14-year-old son Frank knocked on doors and sold it to department stores. His other son Edwin kept the books. The family sold their candy for 20 cents a pound, half the price of every competitor in Chicago, because Emil Brach believed that if you made the best candy at the lowest price, people would find you. They did. By 1911, he was producing 25 tons a week. By 1918, 1,000 tons. By 1923, he had built the largest candy factory in the world, a $5 million complex on Kinzie Street that covered 23 acres and produced over 2 million pounds of candy every single day. 127 varieties, 3,500 employees. The sweet smell of butterscotch drifting over the west side of Chicago like weather. It was Frank, the boy who had sold candy door to door at 14, who invented the Pick-a-Mix concept in 1958. The old general stores had sold candy from barrels. Frank saw that the barrels were gone, but the desire was not, and he built a display that brought the barrel experience into the modern supermarket. Open bins, metal scoops, one price per pound. The idea spread across the country so fast that within a decade you could not walk into a grocery store in America without passing a Brach's Pick-a-Mix display on your way to the checkout. By 1986, Brach's controlled 2/3 of the entire American market for bagged and bulk candy, $640 million in sales. The largest non-chocolate candy operation in the country, built on a $1,000 investment and a father's belief that good candy at a fair price would always win. Then the family lost the company, and the company lost everything that made it worth keeping. American Home Products bought Brach's in 1966. They sold it to a Swiss firm. The Swiss sold it to a German investor. The German let it slide into bankruptcy. New owners came and went like tenants in a building nobody wanted to repair. The Chicago factory, the one Emil Brach had built with $5 million Depression-era dollars, the one that had employed 3,500 people, the one that had perfumed the West Side with Butterscotch for 80 years, closed in 2003. Over 1,000 workers lost their jobs in a single announcement. Production moved to Mexico. The building stood empty for 5 years, its windows broken, its halls silent, its candy kettles cold. In 2008, Christopher Nolan used it as Gotham Hospital in The Dark Knight, and then blew part of it up on camera. A few years later, the rest was demolished. The largest candy factory in the world was now a vacant lot on the west side of Chicago, and the only thing left of Emil Brach's Palace of Sweets was the name on a bag of candy corn at Walmart, manufactured by an Italian conglomerate that had never seen the inside of that kitchen on North Avenue. The family that built it fared no better than the factory. Helen Brach, who had married into the family and inherited the fortune after her husband passed in 1970, vanished on a February afternoon in 1977. She was last seen leaving the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Her body was never found. For 17 years, nobody was held accountable. Then investigators uncovered a scheme so strange it sounded like fiction. A network of horse traders and con men in the Chicago equestrian world had been swindling wealthy owners and quietly eliminating the ones who threatened to talk. A man named Richard Bailey, who had romanced Helen and sold her horses worth a fraction of what she paid, was convicted of conspiracy in her disappearance and sentenced to life in prison. He never revealed where she was. The woman whose family had filled the candy bowls of a nation disappeared into a mystery that has never been solved, and the only sweetness left behind was the memory of what her family had built before the world took it apart. Some of you brought your own children to those bins. You stood behind them the way your mother once stood behind you, and you watched their faces as they discovered what you had discovered 30 years earlier: that a grocery store could contain a place where you were allowed to choose, where nobody told you which candy to take, where the only limit was the size of the bag and the patience of the adult holding the cart. You watched your son stand on his toes the way you had stood on yours, and you watched him reach for the butterscotch discs, the same ones, the same color, the same cellophane wrapper, and something in your chest moved that you did not expect because you were not watching a child choose candy. You were watching time fold in half. You were your mother. Your son was you. The bins were the same, and for one Saturday morning in a grocery store that smelled exactly the way grocery stores are supposed to smell, nothing had changed and nobody was gone, and the world was still a place where a paper bag full of candy could fix anything that needed fixing. The Pick-a-Mix displays disappeared so quietly that most people did not notice until they were gone. One year, the bins were there at the end of aisle 7, right where they had always been. The next year, they were replaced by a shelf of pre-packaged candy in sealed plastic bags. No scoops, no paper bags, no choosing, no standing on your toes to see what was in the back of the butterscotch bin. The supermarket said it was about hygiene. The lawyers said it was about liability. The accountants said it was about efficiency. All of them were right, and none of them understood what they had taken away. Some of you have tried to buy Brach's candy recently, the butterscotch discs, the caramels, the peppermints. You notice something you wish you had not. It does not taste the same. The recipe changed somewhere between the third and fourth corporate owner, and the candy that arrives in a sealed bag from a factory you will never see is not the candy your grandmother put in the crystal bowl. It is close. It is almost right. But almost right is worse than completely different, because completely different would let you forget, and almost right keeps reminding you of exactly what you lost. There is a woman in Ohio who was cleaning out her mother's house last spring after the funeral, and she found a crystal bowl in the back of a cabinet, empty, washed clean, stored carefully between two dish towels her mother had folded by hand. She held it for a long time. She did not put candy in it because the candy that belonged in that bowl does not exist anymore. Not the real kind, not the kind that tasted the way it tasted when you were 7, and your grandmother's house was the safest place on earth, and the butterscotch was always there, and nobody asked you to explain why you needed another one. She put the bowl on her own coffee table. It is still empty. She cannot bring herself to fill it with anything else. The Brach's Pick-a-Mix bin stood at the end of aisle 7, and it was not about candy. It was about choosing. It was about a child standing in front of 40 bins and being trusted to decide, to scoop, to hold the bag, to hand it to the cashier, to carry it to the car. It was about a grandmother who filled a crystal bowl every week because love sometimes looks like butterscotch in November. It was about a man who arrived in Chicago with nothing and built a palace of sweets with a single kettle and $1,000 and a belief that the world would always want something sweet if you made it well enough and sold it fairly. The bins are gone now, the factory is gone, the grandmother is gone, but the taste is still in your mouth if you close your eyes, and the weight of that metal scoop is still in your hand, and the sound of candy falling into a paper bag is still the sound of a Saturday morning in a grocery store that does not exist anymore. In a world that has decided everything worth having should come in a sealed package with a barcode and an expiration date. What was your favorite candy from the Brach's Pick-a-Mix bin? Does your grandmother's bowl still exist?